Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon or good evening, depending where you're from. We have participants from Silicon Valley to Singapore on the call. So it's going to be an exciting day to network with people from over 55 service provider organizations from all over the world. I'm going to start out the day by talking about why Cavell sees an accelerating pace of change in the cloud networking market and what its implications are to the service providers. But before I do, I want to thank our sponsors. Without them, we couldn't have events like this, and we couldn't provide the free content to you. Please drop by their booths and introduce yourself and learn what they're doing in the marketplace. When we started 2 or 3 years ago, we always called this market cloud networking, even when we were focusing mainly on SD-WAN. And the reason was, the primary purpose, particularly of SD-WAN, was to connect the sites, the buildings, and the people to applications that had moved to the cloud. And because they had moved to the cloud, you, of course, had to change your connectivity strategies. If you look at most research, it's focused in the cloud area and on multi-cloud and how much people have progressed on this cloud journey in terms of their applications. It's focused on large enterprise, and it has very high numbers for the people that are already on multi-cloud. When they say multi-cloud, they mean really hybrid cloud, both your old data centers, virtualized environments in places like Equinix, and of course the public cloud itself. But what we found is that when you look at a broader base, we researched over 2,000 enterprises, and a lot of them were much smaller than larger. It was the small to the mid market. So these results are weighted that way. It includes large enterprise. But not everybody is on the same place on the journey. There's quite a few organizations who don't think they have anything on the cloud. That might be because they don't know things like what's up or on the cloud. But you'll see, even with, in our research of the enterprise, most organizations have applications in the cloud. Many of them are still only in a few clouds. But they're expected to grow to multi-cloud operations within the very foreseeable future. The thing you always have to remember, especially in Europe, but really in any region in the world, is it's not the same. Cloud adoption depends on the country you're in. Now, this is an eye chart, but it's from Eurostat, and it measures what the cloud adoption rate in 2018 versus 2014 is for all the countries in the European Union. And you can just see visually that there are a lot of countries that are way further ahead than others. So, bottom line is, when you're a service provider, you're going to be talking to people who are trying to move their applications onto the cloud, but you have to be context aware, context of the individual enterprise that you're talking to. Each one has its own journey, but also what industry you're in, what size of segment you're in what country you're in, because it won't all be the same. So cloud networking is supposed to improve the enterprise experience in using the clouds. It started out with the SD-WAN providers looking at improving access and application performance within the cloud. Now, that access improvement had two flavors. The one where you actually get into repairing the quality and problems on the line with things like forward error correction and other techniques, or WAN optimization if the applications were further away across the region or even interregional. A lot of that functionality still applies, but it's quite specific to what region you're in, what country you're in, even what site you're in, because what we found working with carriers around the world and their customers is, in some places, access is quite good and doesn't need repair. In other regions or in other locations within a country, it's a very key feature. Also, WAN optimization applies mainly to very distant applications. There are other reasons why you might have to optimize. And those cases are becoming rarer as things come to public SaaS and people serve content on content data networks. What remains is the importance of bundling access and higher availability and the focus on applications. So application performance and visibility is at the core of the value that you bring to the enterprise as you start taking them through the migration and transformation of their network to be cloud-centric. And they expect you to behave like a cloud service. And that's a kind of vague concept, and particularly for a lot of old-fashioned service providers and telcos like me, who came from the infrastructure environment. But it's a really deep-seated expectation on the part of the enterprises that have spent the last 4 or 5 years working with cloud compute, working with SaaS services, where they can control their destiny, where they can scale. So I think the two main characteristics that traditional service providers are still struggling a bit with is the idea of being able to scale, and that means scale down as well as up. We've been in a lot of places where the service provider still goes through normal contracting, lots of T's and C's, lots of people, lots of manual processes. And yes, you can upgrade your service, but not very easy to downgrade the service in any given area. The other thing that service providers have struggled with, which is an inherent cloud capability, is allowing the enterprises to self-direct what they want to do with the cloud network. Build, not only the IT groups in a lot of cases, maybe not to the IT groups' joy, it's often even the business units or the business people that want to be able to bring up services, to experiment, and to move fast. This is a problem in a lot of service provider environments, and the industry is spending a lot of time focusing on the issues of even the words aren't that great, co-managed or co-piloted networks. So where the dividing lines are, what the users can and can't do, both the individual people within the enterprises and the enterprises themselves, is a major area where product managers, service managers have to design their services for greater simplicity. And of course, as it's coming into carrier portals, just the pace of change on the feature set, which we'll talk about, creates a lot of problems with this co-management and portal area. And of course, anything you do in cloud networking has to be done securely. We're going to talk a lot about this later, so I'll move on. The other thing we wanted to point out is that cloud networking is increasingly being built on cloud infrastructure, not necessarily on service provider infrastructure, and not in the telco data centers. I first started becoming aware of how big the cloud networks were becoming, their backbone networks, when parts of my former team at Level 3 went to Google. And they were submarine cable guys. So it was pretty clear that Google back in 2007 were building submarine cables. Then the outside plant guys went. So they were building land-based fiber as well. We knew it was there. We knew they had high capacity networks between their data centers, no matter which one of the major cloud providers. But it really started to hit home when Telegeography in 2019 put up this chart, which shows how much capacity on the major routes is owned by the cloud providers, the content providers, as they call it. It's the orange bit. The red bit is the traditional carriers, tier 1 ISPs, etc. So a massive capacity and therefore cost advantage. But when we thought, well, yeah, it's just between their data centers. It's for their own use. Other people can't really use this service. It would be difficult to get on and off the island. But if you look at the type of network they built, and we can do so because Microsoft in their last announcement kindly provided the figures, Microsoft Azure, for an example of one of the majors, has 170 POPs, where 200 operators have already built into their infrastructure using express routes. But it's not just direct connection for high performance for enterprise. The Microsoft is present at 286 public peering points according to the peering database. These peering points sometimes are just on different floors within the peering, so it's a smaller number of what you'd consider internet exchanges, but these are just the public ones. They also have private peering points. And they have over 20,000 peering connections. So they're a tier 1 carrier in terms of interconnection. So if you think about it, service providers, particularly the ones that are below the tier 1 level, have a whole new toolkit. It's not just the network, it's a network that's connected to a very rich data center compute environment. Again, sticking with Azure for operators because it brought home the point. There's been a lot of announcements from Amazon, from Google about transit services, internet, multi-cloud networking services, but I'm going to stick on Azure because it came out recently, and it's pretty clear. The blue bits are what they expect the service providers to do. Package it, distribute it, use DevOps to tie up together all of these parts of the solution. But everything else, all the gray stuff is what Microsoft will be doing. And it ranges, from their new acquisitions of Packet Core and Cloud.com networking solutions. So some vendors should be a little bit concerned. To all the application and vertical solution libraries they've already built into the environment, to how they get it out to the edge, and then of course the big network that we were just talking to you about. And Google could put up the same type of cloud, and so could Amazon. The thing to remember is these are just components, even if they're more than just an idea. And the expectation is that they're working with large service providers who have DevOps teams who are stringing these together and creating real services. There are going to be intermediaries and new types of service providers in this market. So one example that you're going to be hearing more from today is Alkira, who looks at all the networking components that exist within the cloud native environment, but adds to it, ties it together, connects it to the outside world, and adds marketplaces of features. And the packages this all together in a consumable service, fully packaged service. So you could, if you were a service provider, just resell it if you wanted to and white label it, or it's fully accessible via APIs and SDK so that you can integrate it more fully into your services. And then all the traditional vendors, SD-WAN vendors, big players, are also beginning to do more and more themselves on the cloud. It used to be kind of uncommon for a vendor to offer a hosted managed service. It was seen as competing against the service providers. But the experiences and the difficulties we talked about on making SD-WAN and all these services move fast enough and look cloud-like enough, I think it's convinced most service providers that they need to host the platforms and in addition to hosting it themselves, sell it back to the service providers, particularly the MSPs, as a fully managed service that can be consumed as needed. We'll talk a little bit about the data lakes behind this a bit later in the presentation. So if it wasn't enough that you have the major players becoming much more open in the market, building up their capabilities and their sales and product solution teams to the service providers, you had another major shift this year, which was the pandemic, which obviously put everybody at home. And that, if you think about it, reinforces shifts to things in the cloud. Because if you're at home, you don't have an MPLS network. So, yeah, we all enjoy it. We all are hopefully better behaved than some of the stories coming out recently of what people do on Zoom calls. But I think, what we have to remember in the industry is we see this as something just as a progression of what was naturally happening anyways. All of us work from home, work on the road, see a lot of our colleagues over virtual events. But you have to remember that's not universally true for a lot of industries. I mean, think hospitality, for example, think construction, think a lot of sectors. So when we went out and looked at the enterprise, this happens to be from the US research, if you looked at those who had more than 50% of their workforce actually working from home during the pandemic, it was only 44%. But that was a sharp step up. And it's expected not to go back to the pre-COVID levels. It means that priorities are reshuffled. And what does it really mean? As I said, working from home reinforces cloud-first, internet-first enterprise strategies. And I just put up, because it was also a recent announcement, VMware's SASE Pop. You hear a lot about SASE in the market, but the thing to look at this, and not necessarily the title SASE, it's that they're pulling together the SD-WAN portions of it, but also what they call secure access, which is, people realize a lot of enterprises were still on IP VPN concentrators, so the platforms are scrambling to get these into their overall managed orchestrators and solutions. They're also looking at their form factors, their prices, sponsoring home trials, doing just about anything they can to make themselves relevant to the home. And then they hope even more relevant when people do come partially back to the buildings into the hybrid workplace. And you can see a lot of this on the vendor websites, what they're doing, like contract tracing and others in the hybrid workplace. So, service provider side, first, it was just a mad scramble to get the capacity right, get the concentrators right. But now, while capacity is still an issue, service providers really are stepping back and looking at a more strategic view of what they're going to do in the future. They're looking at how they're going to package and integrate these services more, with more emphasis on cloud security, on mobility, FMC type packages, and of course SD-WAN. Buildings aren't going away, but the mix of services and what's emphasized could well change. So, again, as a service provider, your industry segmentation, just as it impacts cloud adoption, is also going to really impact what the process and what the weight and what's important inside your customer. How are the platforms evolving in this, very choppy market? Well, if you look back to what we have always shown, this was from 2019 in Washington, so over a year ago, we always talked about the fact that there were more than 60 vendors in the marketplace. I think despite consolidation, there probably still are, and that they came from different places. Some came from a lot of them, the early leaders like Ariaka, Silver Peak, Infovista, Riverbed came from WAN optimization and brought to the market the focus on the application and application performance management. Others came more from the LAN side, and they're fast-moving ones, like Meraki and Aruba, are taking on a lot of the marketplace. And Velo Cloud kind of sat between these two worlds, but was also a very fast, high-volume early player. And then you had the more traditional routing, and you had at that time, newer entrants that were the security players adding SD-WAN functionality to their solutions in order to hold their base and increase wallet size in the enterprises. You got to remember, early days, I think it's just changed, but Fortinet was offering SD-WAN as a free add-on to their Fortinet appliances. So, the picture has changed a little bit, but by consolidation, there's some big ones that have come out recently. But you can kind of see the themes of the WAN players coming in and dominating with the Aruba and Mist combinations. You also probably, the ribbon Edgewater combination. A lot of people didn't focus on that, but it was a desire to find a solution that worked for smaller sites and worked well with voice. There's lots of Edgewater devices out in the world, particularly in the US. And now they've just added on ECI, which is more into the core networking area in the SD-WAN, and of course, Palo Alto and CloudGenix. The really interesting one to me is Mist, Juniper plus 128, because this is where you begin to see shifts in architecture. It's dominated by the Mist perspective, and which puts the emphasis on the LAN, and it makes the solution more focused on client to cloud rather than building to cloud. So the platforms are evolving in a number of directions. First of all, they're evolving always in security. Big people coming into security. Most platforms are trying to increase the amount of security functions directly developed and available on the platform. But what we see in reality in the large enterprises is a lot of solutions really are more focused on taking the SD-WAN product and integrating it into someone like Zscaler. Remember, Zscaler, I think, grew 49% last quarter. So, Zscaler is a very important part of this overall security market. And as are like Palo Alto, who you're hearing from, but they're shifting a lot of resources into the cloud as well. The other big change is, we talked about the wireless LAN. It means these solutions are moving into the building. And if you're a service provider, that service providers aren't always that successful in managed LAN solutions. Luckily, the portals, which are now being hosted in the cloud, provide a lot more functionality and have thought through the simplification. And probably most important, because these vendor solutions are now hosted in the cloud, sold back as managed service, the vendors have access to multiple service provider, multiple enterprise statistics across a huge range of sensors and devices. And so they're moving heavily into the analytics area to health assurance and all other lots of other kind of applications we could spend a day on. So it's a lot of functionality to track. Cavell, as you'll hear soon, is very active in migrating large enterprises with a number of different vendors. So we started early on trying to aggregate all this into some kind of semblance of structured knowledge, tracked over 300 items per vendor, and then in our consulting jobs would try to make sense of it for the requirements of the customer. We're just now rolling out very soon, and you can see it today in the booth if you'd like to, a web-based cloud networking expert tool, which makes this publicly available and consumable on the web. So we're cloudifying our knowledge as well. Stop by the booth to see it. Finally, let me just come back to the service providers. The large provider SD-WAN offerings have gained traction. People have a lot of experience. You'll hear on the panels about some of the successes, and some of them have been very big. But we dig deeper into the channel, and I'm going to focus now again on Europe, where we see, if you look the layers down, it's still lagging in terms of people really rolling out full-blown services. So to start with, I start with a chart that looks quite similar to what we showed in Washington, with only 15% of the channel, of the MSPs, SIs, offering SD-WAN, but that's of a much bigger pool. And what you can do, you can break that down and see that a lot of it is towards the mid-market now. And surprisingly, it's Germany in second place to the UK. You wouldn't, from what we understand of cloud adoption rates, you wouldn't expect that. Sorry, my pointer has just stopped working. There we go. So the takeaways from today's session are, don't forget about that this is the enterprise journey to the cloud that's the focus. Don't talk about the network too much, certainly not at the beginning. Do micro-segment and understand the business needs of your client, because if you don't, you're going to be spending endless time in a very crowded market in terms of message and competitors. And start thinking about how you can learn to move a lot faster, particularly a big opportunity for the MSPs and small organizations. You probably already know how to look externally, how to try things, and fail fast if it's going to fail, and keep going. And remember, if you're a smaller organization, you're no longer bound by the network footprint. Doesn't mean you shouldn't concentrate on a vertical segment or a particular national market, but you can do things for your customer base that used to be very difficult. And keep in mind to enable your customers, enable your sales force, enable your technical teams, because the change is significant. We have most of our team around, a lot of our team around today, and addition to the directors, the engineering services team is here, and they have experience in migration of SD-WAN networks, not just migration, but the design and the implementation. We have our analyst services teams, who most of you know well, including Finbar, who you'll hear from later, Patrick, who's all things collaboration in Microsoft, and Dom, who you'll also hear from, and then our events team, Francesca, you've always met. Please reach out to them if you need any help. And with this, we'll take a short break before going into our first panel.